Everyone, I just wanted to give y'all a few quick notes on Emily Dickinson and how it kind of ties into one of your reflections from this week, and how this classic poetry that we've been kind of taking a look at this week actually kind of ties into some very modern pieces of literature and movies and whatnot. So just a quick note. I'd watch the YouTube video that I posted on Dickinson first. If you haven't, it's okay, but I think it would be helpful if you watched it first. But as I said, if you don't, it's fine. So things that we know about Dickinson: she was a very reclusive individual who didn't want most of her work shared with the world. About 10 of her poems were published in her lifetime, and they were heavily edited. Who knows what kind of impact that had on her view of sharing her poetry with the world. But her works were published after they were discovered. After her death, her family had them published against her wishes. And then, that's a huge moral debate. Do you follow someone's wishes, or do you do what you feel like you need to do? And many scholars are very glad they shared her poetry with the world, because she was very different from what was considered normal for the time. Poetry in the 1800s was very much what we consider kind of, very traditional poetry, rhyme scheme, meter, all that lovely stuff. And she kind of broke that convention and was very influential in how poetry progressed into the 20th and 21st centuries. And so her published works really have influenced a lot in the poetry world. And allusions to her work still show up to this day. So if you have read The Fault in Our Stars or seen the movie, this is a great example. The book was written by John Green, and in the book, the main character Hazel is obsessed with a book called An Imperial Affliction, which is a line from a Dickinson poem, A Certain Slant of Light. So Hazel's battling an incurable cancer, and the main character of this book, I think her name was Anna, is also battling cancer. And the book ends the Imperial Affliction fictional book ends very quickly, and Hazel's wants to know what happened to the main character and her family. And so she starts on this journey to find out what happened, and that's like a huge plot line of the book. And I don't want to give away too much of The Fault in Our Stars, just in case you haven't read it, or you might want to read it. So I don't want to give away any major spoilers, but it's a really interesting book, and it's interesting that John Green chose this poem, A Certain Slant of Light, in that line from An Imperial Affliction in his book, because we'll read the poem first and I'll kind of get into it. So it's a very typical Dickinson poem. There it has lots of allusions to death and darkness and nature, and so I'll read it for you real quick. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where meanings are. None may teach it any, 'tis the seal of despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes to the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So not a very happy poem. Most of her poems were not very happy, and this is a very typical, as I said, Dickinson poem. So like many of her poems, it deals with death. The title comes from the first line, like all of her poems, because she didn't title her poems, and so the easiest way to do it was to title them by their first lines. So that certain slant of light is meant to imply the feeling of darkness of a winter funeral, or possibly it could just be the depression or winter blues that many of us feel during that season. Of course, Dickinson's no longer with us, and so we just kind of have to imply, kind of based off of her other poems, and what the subject matters of them were. And a lot of them were dealing with death. And so, there's a lot of debate amongst scholars. Did she suffer from depression? Is that why she was so reclusive? Possibly anxiety, depression. We don't know. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Mental health in the 1800s, there basically were no treatments. There were no drugs. A lot of people who were deemed mentally incompetent were sent to asylums. That's where if any of you ever watch any of those ghost hunting shows, they always go to the mental asylums where all the greatest hauntings happened. And it's just because they didn't have any effective treatments for mental illness. So a lot of times when possibly someone was suffering from mental illness, they suffered in silence because they didn't want to go to an institution. Their families didn't want to put them there for whatever reason. And again, we don't know if that's what was happening with Dickinson. But I mean, a lot of her poems definitely show she had a very dark side to her, just that obsession with death. One of the other popular theories is that she might have been autistic. Just because of her wanting to wear the same color, which was white, over and over again in her later years. And then again, her not really wanting to interact with the world, or her inability to interact with the world. Again, we don't know. But it is really interesting to note is this idea of despair. And an imperial affliction is considered like despair. When you look at what was happening in the beliefs during that time period, despair had a deeper meaning. Like we hear despair today, and of course it's very serious. But back then, it was likened to a condemnation to hell, basically, because despair was almost like a sin. And so her really emphasizing that in this poem, maybe it was a religious crisis. Again, we're not 100% sure. So regardless, it shows the depth of hurt one can feel, with just the perfect title for this fictional book within this fictional book about a young girl dying of cancer. So that whole idea of a certain slant of light, this is a cool literary allusion that shows the brilliance of John's screenwriting, because he actually uses the title of the poem later in the book during a funeral scene. So someone Hazel knows who also had cancer passes away. And this is a section from the book. And so if we go down here, it says, I just stared out the window for a while. I really didn't want to go. And then she's talking about going to the cemetery. I didn't want to see them lower him into the ground, into the spot he picked out with his dad. And I didn't want to see his parents sink their knees into the dew-wet grass and moan in pain. And I didn't want to see Peter Van Houten's alcoholic belly stretched against his linen jacket. And I didn't want to cry in front of a bunch of people. And I didn't want to toss a handful of dirt onto his grave. And I didn't want my parents to have to stand there beneath the clear blue sky with its certain slant of afternoon light, thinking about their day and their kid and my plot and my casket and my dirt. But I did these things. I did all of them and worse because Mom and Dad felt we should. So John Green takes that line from the title of the poem where he got the idea of imperial affliction for the book that Hazel was obsessed with, and he uses it again in the story, which I think is just a really cool way of how he kind of brought it full circle, that certain slant of afternoon light. Now, he changed it just a little bit, but the implication is there. This whole idea of death and despair from the poem showing up again in this particular section of the book and Hazel talking. So Dickinson today, from movies to television to academic scholars, novels, she has such a great influence on the world, and especially the world of poetry today. So if you have Apple Plus, consider taking a look at the television show Dickinson. They've taken some modern ideals and applied them, which is a really common thing that people are doing now. They're kind of taking these older poems or people or ideas, and they're trying to put modern sensibilities on them. And I don't really know how I feel about that. There is some thought that Emily Dickinson might have been bisexual, and they explore this in the show. There is actually some evidence based off of the letters to her sister-in-law and whatnot that there might have been a slight romantic relationship there. Now, if that's actually the case, again, we don't know. Sometimes I wonder how people who are dead would feel about how people view them today, but there we go. But I mean, it is really interesting to see how maybe Dickinson became the woman she is today, that we all know of today.